Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Caitlin Clarkson Pereira, and I am the Executive Director of GVPedia. And today we're going to be discussing permitless carry and the impact that this legislation can have on our communities. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin today's session. The first is that this session is being recorded, and we ask that all participants keep yourselves on mute throughout the session. Some of you did submit questions when you filled out your RSVP form, so we'll try to get to those when we're done with the presentation. And then if you have any other questions that come into your mind as we are presenting, feel free to put those in the chat box and we'll try to answer all of those for you. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Devin Hughes, who is the founder of GVPedia. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about GVPedia. We are a comprehensive resource providing access to our gun safety database, which is the largest in existence. We've recently updated it. It now has over 1,700 studies. We also have GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. And both the database and university are easily searchable and provide an excellent resource for educational and advocacy purposes. GVP University is also home to the Facts About Firearm Policy Initiative, which we launched last year. So I'm now going to turn this conversation over to Devin, who is going to lead us on a presentation in permitless carry today. Devin?
Well, thank you, Caitlin. Let me go ahead and pull up a few of the slides real quick.
Sure.
All right.
And just before Devin begins, just for to touch on some vocabulary. So when we say permitless carry, that's something that you might hear gun lobbyists refer to as constitutional carry. So just something to keep in mind throughout this presentation that two different terms mean the same thing. So if the constitutional carry is something that you recognize, just know that here in this presentation, we're going to be calling it constitutional carry. So Devin, to start off, can you give us a brief overview as to what permitless carry laws are and what states have them or are considering them?
Yeah, so permitless carry is basically the typical concealed carry system, but without any of the background checks or training involved. So previously, well, way back in the day, most states had may issue or no issue, meaning that either people could not carry a concealed firearm in public, or they had to go through a process, basically have a police interview, training, and to make sure that they were fully qualified to be able to carry that firearm. In the 90s and early 2000s, the tide started to shift where many states moved to a right to carry system, which basically means as long as somebody passes a background check and can do the very basic training, they could carry a handgun in public. There is no police or authority oversight of the process other than conducting the background check. And then most or many states are now moving towards permitless carry, where now somebody can carry a firearm in public with no training and not having to go through a background check. Now, people who are still prohibited purchasers, it's still illegal for those individuals to carry in public, but overall the permitless carry system removes a whole lot of safeguards, even if those safeguards under a right to carry system were still very lacking. And then to kind of highlight this change, I struggled in vain to find a better map than this, but unfortunately Wikipedia was what was there to provide a timely one. And this was right to carry and permitless carry states in 2021. The permitless carry states are in green here, and the shall issue or right to carry states are in blue. And so what used to be almost all right to carry states, a lot of them have now shifted to permitless carry. And there's more states, unfortunately, being added to this list each year. So for example, right now, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Nebraska, and Ohio have permitless carry bills that are still up for consideration and have a chance of passing. In particular, the gun lobby is targeting Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, and Ohio Nebraska seems like they might be able to fight this bill off. I do know that there were other states that had permitless carry bills this session. Colorado was one that defeated the permitless carry bill in committee. Florida's still might be ongoing. South Carolina tends to propose these once every year and it gets stalled. And there's other states as well that have been fighting these, but the current states to be on the lookout for are Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Nebraska, and Ohio. If your state is facing a permitless carry bill that you feel has a good shot at passing and I don't have it up here, please put it in chat so we can update that information. But that's generally the landscape that we're facing with permitless carry right now.
Devin, can you tell us a little bit about what the impact of permitless carry is?
Sure. So the basic impact, and unfortunately there aren't all that many academic studies right now that focus specifically on permitless carry, largely because this is a new trend in states and it takes a couple years for the data to get out there and for academics to put together papers on it. So my guess is there will be substantially more research coming out in the next few years. But given that we didn't want to wait for that, GVPedia has conducted its own analysis, which is the chart that's currently showing. So what we did is we took firearm homicide data from the CDC and looked at the states that have passed permitless carry from 3 years before it passed permitless carry to 3 years after. And then we compared that to the national average of other states during that same time period to figure out what the country's overall gun homicide rate was doing. And so the blue line in this chart are the permitless carry states that have been averaged together over this 3 years before to 3 years after time period for passing permitless carry versus the gray line, which is the national average. And states that passed permitless carry saw their gun homicide rates increase by 22%. Now with CDC data, the CDC does not allow people to access data if there's 10 or fewer incidents in a state. So there are several small states such as Wyoming and Vermont where basically the gun homicide, there's fewer than 10 gun homicides each year. However, if you include those states with the data that's available in this analysis, the rate jumps from a 22% increase to a 36% increase. However, I wanted to make sure for the purposes of this analysis that we were only tracking the states that had all of the data available for the entire time period. But again, including smaller states actually increases the gun homicide rate increase even further. We also looked at overall homicides as well as gun deaths, and both of those categories increased as well versus the national average, though the overwhelming majority of that increase was due to gun homicides. So basically, when you're weakening concealed carry laws, you're having a negative impact on gun deaths, and more specifically, gun homicides.
So the next question I have is two parts. So the first part of the question is, what arguments are pro-gun advocates using, and how does permitless carry intersect with various pro-gun myths, such as the myth that more guns mean less crime, or the myth that there is widespread defensive gun use? And what are the best ways to counter these myths, specifically in the context of permitless carry?
So this is a very detailed question. What most of what I'm going to talk about with the slides is going to be on, because the permitless carry debate provides an excellent case study of how disinformation interacts with laws that pop up at the state and national level. And some of the most common myths that I've encountered in this specific debate are the following claims: that most academic studies and academics out there actually think that weakening concealed carry laws will reduce crime. So they see permitless carry as a crime reducing measure rather than a crime increasing one. There's the idea that permit holders are extremely law abiding and that therefore there's no need to fear having permitless carry or weakening concealed carry laws. There's the myth that defensive gun use is widespread. The figure that's frequently tried out are 2.5 million defensive gun uses annually, which is a vast overestimate, as we've done GVPedia explains on before, and I'll go into a bit again. There's another myth that defensive gun use is more common than gun crime. That's been popping up quite regularly. And finally, there's the idea that defensive gun use is the most effective way to protect oneself. And one thing that I'd like to go into just for a bit before diving into the myths is to show all of you the handouts that are being presented at hearings across these states. So that way, if you see this handout or a legislator ask you about it, you know where it comes from. So I'm going to shift my screen share real quick to what has to be some of the worst charts I've ever seen, but here it is. So this is an analysis conducted by a Professor Carl Moody at the College of William and Mary. And he's a research director for the Crime Prevention Research Center, which you might recognize as John Lott's organization. But they've been putting out charts such as this right here in basically a 3-page PDF handout that shows what they say is the murder rate, police officer deaths, and gun homicide rates before and after permitless carry. And as you can see in this first chart, as well as the next chart and the chart after, they show a decrease in firearm homicides and murders overall after permitless carry is passed. Now, this information is definitely incorrect, and if you want to ask me about it afterwards, I can explain in more detail why it's statistically inaccurate. They did a lot of stuff that makes absolutely no sense to get these charts. But I just want you to be aware that these are out there and is what you'll likely be facing if permitless carry is in your state or will come to your state. So with that being said, I'm going to return to the slides. And just a moment to get back here. All right, so the first myth, the idea that most academic studies and academics think that weakening concealed carry laws reduce crime. This pops up all the time with permitless carry debates. It also popped up before the Supreme Court case where you had the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin that's currently pending. And multiple amicus briefs from the other side made this particular claim, and it's just not true. So GVPedia has conducted its own literature review of academic studies that look at the country overall and determine the impact of weakening concealed carry laws. And we looked at such studies since 1996, and we found 65 studies that examined this question. And so from 1996 to present, there were 26 studies that indicated that weakening concealed carry laws increases crime. 21 studies found no effect of such laws on violent crime, and 18 found that weakening concealed carry laws decreases crime. However, a lot of these studies are really old. And in 2005, the National Research Council convened a panel meeting to determine what the impact of these and other laws were on violent crime and deaths. And they came to the conclusion that the research before 2005 really didn't answer this question well. And they found a number of flaws in the literature before 2005. So after this report was published, academics took these findings to heart and made sure to improve their methodology and how they studied concealed carry laws. So since 2005, which are basically the modern academic research, you've had 35 studies. And of those 35 studies, 23 found an increase in crime, 7 found no effect, and 5 found a decrease, meaning a substantial majority of the modern academic research finds that weakening concealed carry laws increases violent crime, in particular aggravated assaults and firearm homicides or murders overall. So that's where the academic studies are currently. When we move to what the academics themselves who publish these studies think, you get a very similar result. 70% of the academics who have published research since 2005 on this question have found that concealed carry laws increase crime, and that those findings would likely apply to permitless carry as well. 20% found no effect, and 7, which makes 10% of the sample, found that it decreased. And of that 7, most of them were, half of them work for the Crime Prevention Research Center or John Lott's organization. So it's a very small minority of academics who actually study this topic who think that weakening concealed carry laws decrease, and the overwhelming majority of evidence finds an increase. So the next myth I want to cover briefly is the idea that permit holders are extremely law-abiding. And there is a slight kernel of truth to this, because in order to get a permit to conceal carry a firearm, you have to pass a background check, which means that you typically do not have a felony on your record. And so already there is a safeguard in place, even if it's not the strongest safeguard. But in order to make this claim, researchers such as Dr. Moody and John Lott mention permit holder revocation data, which is basically when somebody who had a permit gets that permit revoked to where they can no longer conceal carry. The problem with relying on this data is that an overwhelming majority of that data is missing or cannot be accessed by the public. There's multiple states out there that have laws explicitly stating that you cannot have permit holder data available to the public. So you wouldn't be able to tell if somebody had their permit revoked. In states that don't have those sort of laws blocking access to the underlying data, newspapers have gone in and done investigative reports. One of these reports was in Michigan, which found that between 75 and 80% of permit holder revocations where somebody committed a crime and they should have had their permit revoked, they actually didn't have their permit revoked. So the court system was missing a whole lot of these cases. And investigation in North Carolina data by the New York Times found the exact same thing, where more than half of the felony convictions were not showing up and having somebody lose their ability to carry a firearm in public. So with all of the missing data that's out there, and just the court system not recognizing when people need to have their right or their ability to carry a firearm in public removed from them, you just cannot say with any confidence that permit holders are extremely law-abiding. And further, in the context of permitless carry, this argument doesn't make sense, because what permitless carry laws do is they remove the permit process from being for somebody wanting to carry a gun in public. So they're negating the training and the background check that would prevent people from carrying in the first place. The final one of the largest myths that shows up with permitless carry is the idea that permitless carry will make it much easier for people to protect themselves, and that people are protecting themselves with firearms millions of times each year. This is simply not true. There is no hard data to support this. The best empirical data comes from the Gun Violence Archive, which finds that there are around 2,000 verified defensive gun uses, meaning that there's police report or a media report of the incidents. And when you compare that to deaths from firearms, which are now above 40,000, tens of thousands more injuries, hundreds of thousands more abuses and thefts of firearms, firearms are far more likely to harm someone than to help protect them. With that being said, one of the more interesting claims that often catches some people by surprise, like even noted reporters can be caught off guard by this, are claims that defensive gun use is more common than crimes with firearms. And the figure that's often put out there is that guns are used in self-defense 4 to 5 times more than such gun crimes. And this is a rather bizarre claim because every survey and every study that looks at both gun crimes and defensive gun uses finds that gun crimes are substantially more common than defensive gun uses. In order to manufacture this claim, what pro-gun advocates will do is that they'll look at private surveys, like Gary Kleck's surveys that found 2.5 million defensive gun uses, and then compare that to the National Crime Victimization Survey total for gun crimes overall. So on the screen, they're basically taking box B of 2.5 million and then comparing it to box C of 800,000. And that's where they get the 4 to 5 times more common. However, the National Crime Victimization Survey and private surveys have quite different methodologies in terms of weeding out people who might not be fully honest on the survey and other measures to ensure the accuracy of the data. And so to do an honest comparison here of the surveys, you'd want to compare box A with box B and box C with box D. Basically, either compare private surveys together or the National Crime Victimization Survey together, or look at hard empirical data such as that from the CDC and Gun Violence Archive. And all of those methods show that there's far more gun crime than defensive gun use. But just by basically a very dishonest comparison across surveys, gun advocates are able to manufacture this sort of claim, which simply does not have support. And as an additional irony on top of this, comparing the defensive gun use numbers from small private surveys that show 2.5 million versus the National Crime Victimization Survey reveals that the 2.5 million number is impossible. For example, the small private surveys indicate around 1.2 to 1.3 million people use a gun defensively to stop a home break-in. However, there aren't that many home break-ins where people are there at home and are awake at the time that somebody broke into the house. So people would have to use a firearm more than 100% of the time that homes are broken into and people are there at the home in order to make the 2.5 million number possible. So like just doing that comparison reveals how absurd the claim that there is widespread defensive gun use is, yet gun advocates are using it to claim that there's more DGUs than gun crimes. And then the final part of the defensive gun use narrative is that defensive gun uses are the most effective way of preventing injury. And there were initial surveys that somewhat supported this back in the 1990s. However, there's been more recent research done by Harvard that examined this question using National Crime Victimization Survey data. And what they found is that your injury rate when using a gun in self-defense is almost exactly the same as doing nothing in response to a crime. You're injured at about the same rate. And defensive gun use leads to more injuries than running away, calling the police, or as an earlier survey found, even using any weapon other than a firearm in self-defense. So there's really no basis for the claim that DGUs are the most effective way at preventing injury, or the most effective way at protecting oneself. And as the other data shows, having a firearm in the home or on your person is far more likely to harm you or a loved one than it is to protect you. So kind of to wrap up the permitless carry discussion, like those are all the myths that are out there. There's other minor ones as well, but those are the major ones. And the hard data from the CDC shows that permitless carry exacerbates firearm homicide rather than reduces it.
Thank you, Devin. It's really helpful to have a background on what permitless carry is and where it comes from. But something that we've been working on as an organization this legislative session in the past, is communicating with individuals to make sure they have the facts about permitless carry. So we know that when permitless carry laws are presented, obviously there's some issues that come about if those laws pass. So what are some of the best ways to stop those permitless carry laws from passing in the states that they're either being presented in now or in the future?
Yes, so it's pretty difficult because most of the time permitless carry laws come up in states that have overwhelming Republican majorities in them, to where basically if the permitless carry bill reaches the floor, it's going to pass. So a lot of the strategy that I've seen states deploy that's been effective is making sure to stop the bill before it reaches the floor for a public vote. So making sure the bill dies in committee, making sure it never comes up, never really gets a hearing, or when it gets the hearing, it's shelved, or directly going to the governor, because we've seen even Republican governors in some states veto permitless carry bills. And in private conversations I've had in Oklahoma, when we had our bout with permitless carry, which unfortunately passed a couple years ago, you would have Republican state legislators that tell us in private that's like, look, I think this bill is nuts. Like, this should not be the case. But if it goes up for a vote, I have to vote for it. Otherwise, the NRA and my constituents will throw me out and I'll get primaried. And so there's a lot of resistance to these types of bills behind the scenes. And so making sure that basically the resistance occurs there and early on before it gains momentum. And also making sure that the legislators have accurate information at their fingertips when these bills come to pass, so they can quickly see, like, hey, this makes people very unsafe. One area where GVPedia helped with was in Nebraska, where we directly provided information that we put together to the local organization, which then passed it on directly to lawmakers. And they were able to directly challenge John Lott, who appeared to testify there, and made sure that there was statements highlighting Lott's general untrustworthiness in the local media as well, and really putting him on the spot with his inaccurate information. And that appeared to be fairly effective, and at least stopped that tactic of where the gun lobby brings in John Lott and he tries to roll over people with his supposed facts and figures by being able to challenge, like almost in real time with a real-time fact check, is quite effective at winning that messaging war, and then just tough behind the scenes work. And then if permitless carry unfortunately does get passed, given that the state legislators still do tend to be very conservative, it's hard to go to them to get a repeal. Now, if the state legislature becomes more gun safety conscious, then like revisiting these laws is definitely a possibility. Otherwise, going the route of a ballot initiative, I tend to find to be the strongest. Of course, ballot initiatives require substantial funding, but it can be a real rallying cry, because polling, even in deep red states like Oklahoma, shows that permitless carry laws are overwhelmingly unpopular, even among like the staunchest pro-gun people, because like there's still a sense of that they want to be responsible gun owners in some degree, and permitless carry is not responsible. It's encouraging irresponsible gun ownership. And so there's a divide that can be bridged there and can really muster massive majorities. And if the funding there, which is a very massive if, I think it can be a quite powerful tactic and one that should start being deployed in states.
Have there been any states who have successfully rescinded permitless carry once it has passed?
Unfortunately not, in at least to my knowledge, as of like checking this morning. um, in Oklahoma, we did try for a ballot initiative drive in late 2019, but we only had 2 weeks to gather signatures, so that fell through. But then in 2020, we were going to do a major push again, and then the coronavirus pandemic happened, and signature collecting became basically impossible. And the time horizon is kind of past for us, unfortunately. But I think for other states, it's still very much a real possibility. And Oklahoma could definitely revisit this at some point once gathering signatures is fully possible and sort of the mass mobilization that's needed to get a ballot initiative over the finish line. And before I forget as well, I just want to provide these resources that can help with the fact-based messaging around this. So we have a permitless carry fact sheet that you can find on our website that goes into this in greater detail. We have the Facts About Firearm Policy initiative that Caitlin mentioned earlier, where we go into each of the individual myths in much greater detail, and you can search that database by topic. We have a paper on the NYSRPA versus Bruin amicus briefs and going into detail why the pro-gun information there was incorrect. There's a Harvard fact sheet on defensive gun use. That's where I got the chart for the 4 to 5 times more gun crimes or 4 to 5 times more defensive gun uses than gun crimes myth. And then there's also the Gun Violence Archive, where you can look at defensive gun use data for your state and even down to the county level, as well as other data on gun violence.
So a couple of questions that we received on RSVPs and then in the chat here. So how can we find the most updated info on how permitless carry has impacted gun violence in the states in which it has passed?
Like I slightly jumped ahead on that one, but our fact sheet's very good on this. I believe Giffords has a fact sheet as well that you can find on their website. Johns Hopkins has a fact sheet on concealed carry. And then the material we've provided with our analysis of CDC data is probably the best that I'm familiar with right now. Hopefully there'll be academic studies coming in the relatively near future that can provide some statistical analysis on this as well, where you can cite peer-reviewed research.
And Devin, what would you say is the best and most effective way to respond to these myths that you brought up before when you encounter them from individuals or when other organizations are spreading them?
There has been in the past a school of thought where you basically ignore the other side and push through your own messaging, to where basically you just stay on course, keep hammering home your messages, and that'll get through. However, there's academic research that I'm currently going through that examines the impact that disinformation has versus accurate information. And unfortunately, when just both are presented, they can essentially cancel each other out. So all your good, important factual information, by just some basic disinformation can unfortunately counter that. And disinformation in general tends to be stronger than factual information. It's more likely to be memorable, and people are more likely to share it, unfortunately. So what needs to be done is kind of like, rather than debunking, almost a pre-bunking, where you go to various stakeholders and people who are likely to be involved in the decision-making process here, and straight up mention like, hey, you're likely to encounter this disinformation. Here's why it's incorrect, and here's what the accurate information is. And what the research describes, it's basically a vaccine against disinformation. You can inoculate people beforehand, and that can be incredibly powerful at slowing the spread of disinformation. But that alone also isn't sufficient. You really need to blast out accurate information and not necessarily back at like the pro-gun people. Like, there's no real need for like a dialogue with the NRA on stuff like this, where you're like sending your factual information back to them. Instead, figure out which communities and lawmakers that the pro-gun side is looking at, and or pro-gun advocates are trying to reach with their disinformation, and then get to those communities and stakeholders first, and make sure that you're blasting fully accurate information to basically counter the pro-gun disinformation out there. And like, basically being it head on is going to be essential going forward, and can be somewhat counterintuitive, but the research shows that's basically how to counteract substantial disinformation. And in the next couple months, GVPedia will be releasing a full paper on how best to counter disinformation and promote accurate information. So stay tuned for that.
Is there any accountability in the permitless carry process? I'm sure the intricacies of that lie within individual states, but just in general, can you think of any, in any ways we hold people accountable?
So people who are legally prohibited from purchasing or carrying a firearm are still prohibited even under a permitless carry state. It just becomes a whole lot harder to verify, like whether somebody has a license or not. So from a police officer's perspective, like, they're going to have to assume the person they're encountering has a firearm, and now there's no easy way to check whether that person actually did pass a background check or had any sort of training with their firearm. So it dramatically increases the stakes of such interactions. And just in general, like, while people with felony penalties are caught, very often the judges in these cases don't inform people that, like, you're no longer allowed to have firearms or carry firearms. And so there's a basic breakdown of communication at the judicial level even. And so permitless carry just takes the flaws that already existed in the system and amps them up even further. So unfortunately, there's very little accountability in such systems, which is one of the reasons why they should be repealed.
I'm not sure if we know this, but I'll go ahead and ask anyways. What is the estimated number of firearms purchased outside of a licensed dealer who have avoided any background check?
Yeah, so it's rather difficult because, I mean, the market for private sales is vast, and it's extremely hard to tell what's going on there. Before the pandemic, Harvard conducted a couple studies on this and estimated around 20% or so of firearms are sold without a background check in the private market. You also have an undetermined number of firearms that are sold through licensed dealers, but when the background check process is still pending, which is known as the Charleston loophole. And there's not really good data to indicate just how often that occurs. And so there's a problem there as well. But while most firearm sales still do go through a legal channel, that 20% is definitely a concerning number, and one where a system such as permit to purchase would, it's important to enact something like that to where you're getting all these sales that are currently off the books, for there to be a record of them.
I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions here. I don't see any. Are there final thoughts that you would like to leave with us, or any other points that you would like to make before we close up for the day?
I think as we still have a bit of time, I do want to mention that the PDF I shared with all of you earlier showing the pro-gun disinformation basically from John Lott and Carl Moody, they have that PDF. After that PDF was released, GVPedia released its own fact sheet with the chart. Let's see. Hold up. This chart here from the CDC data. John Lott and Carl Moody wrote a response to our fact sheet, which, so if you're sharing our work in these states, which I feel is important and what we have the information here for, you might encounter that, particularly if John Lott appears in your state as well, where he's like, oh, we've countered that information and here's this other packet. And that packet contains a lot of the disinformation that I just explained that we've addressed in the past, such as more guns, less crime myth, the defensive gun use myth in particular. But they also include this rather weird statistical analysis where they talk about how they controlled all these variables and did this very rigorous analysis in their own words. And I went ahead and sent that to Johns Hopkins and Stanford to analyze it. And what they uncovered is that the models and the charts that I showed you are basically meaningless. Carl Moody and John Lott miscoded almost all of their variables of interest, like so their permitless carry variable, or what they're looking at in terms of the impact, is just meaningless. Like, it doesn't actually reflect anything. And in addition to that, they severely over-controlled, which is an advanced econometric concept, and made all sorts of other mistakes. And so, like, the data they're showing in the charts isn't even real to a degree. Whereas the data that we're providing, it's directly from the CDC, and you can basically download data from the CDC to verify it as well, or even conduct your own analysis. But I just want everybody to be aware that there is that extra level of disinformation out there. And we will be releasing a new entry into our Facts About Firearm Policy initiative dedicated to permitless carry and counteracting the disinformation out there.
Thanks, Devin. We have another question here in our chat. Just give me 1 second to. So somebody's asking a question about concealed carry laws and how those might lead to permitless carry laws.
me see if I can pull it up.
Just wondering how relevant data could be compiled before the early 2000s on decreases in homicide rates when so few states had concealed.
Okay, yeah, I see. So most of the academic research on this topic on weakening concealed carry laws are looking at states that moved from no issue, where people just weren't allowed to carry firearms, and may issue, where there was substantial police oversight for who permit, to right to carry laws, where basically all somebody has to do is pass a background check and then take what's often a very meaningless safety course, but still some safety course is better than no safety course. So a lot of the literature before 2005 and even after 2005 is looking at the weakening of concealed carry laws in that fashion. So they're focused on right to carry. However, many states are now moving from right to carry laws to permitless carry laws. And essentially it's taking the worst effect of right to carry laws and then amplifying it by no longer needing a background check or any sort of training to carry a firearm. So it's removing whatever safeguards still existed. And so while right to carry laws themselves increase gun violence, or moving to right to carry laws from stronger laws increases violence, permitless carry makes that even worse. And hopefully there'll be, because a lot of the literature is somewhat old and hasn't caught up to permitless carry yet. Because, for example, our permitless carry chart looks at 12 states that had passed permitless carry, and those are the states that had at least 3 years of data available from the CDC. Since that time, there's now 21 states that have permitless carry. And so there's a massive change, but it takes time for there to be enough data after the laws are passed for academics to take a look at it. And so we're basically waiting for that data to emerge, then for academics to analyze it and come to conclusions after that. So it might be another 2 to 3 years before we're able to officially tell with peer-reviewed research the full impact of permitless carry. But we really can't wait for that. Like, the data that we have available shows that they increase firearm homicides and overall murders and gun deaths as well. And so there's enough to act currently, and then hopefully there'll be even more support later on for such efforts.
Great, thank you. Just so everyone's aware, we'll send out an email later today or tomorrow with some links that Devin had shared on the resources page, just so you have access to all of those. And then we'll also send out a link to this recording once we download it. So, and feel free to share this presentation with anybody who you would like to. And this is part of our GVPedia Explains series, and we've been doing this for over a year now. So if you have any topics that come to mind that you or your organization might find useful, just let us know. We're always looking to explore topics where that we hope that you and your organizations will find useful. So just let us know if there's something in particular that would be of interest to you. So, Devin, any final thoughts today?
I think that's basically it. Thank you so much for joining us during these rather insane times on the world stage. So stay safe and thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone.